In 1656, when Velázquez was 57 years old, he completed the picture known as Las Meninas, the Maids of Honor. It was the most ambitious painting of his illustrious career, a vast canvas showing a group of figures in Velázquez's cavernous studio in the Alcázar, the palace of the Spanish royal family in Madrid. Standing centre stage, attended by 2 maids of honor and other members of her entourage, is the 5-year-old princess, the Infanta Margarita. During Velázquez's many years as chief painter to the Spanish court, his prime task had been the making of royal portraits, and he'd become famous across Europe for his ability to capture a living, breathing likeness. But Las Meninas is so much more than a royal portrait. Here for the first time, Velázquez includes himself among the courtiers. Not only that, he shows himself in the act of painting a monumental canvas. Is it Las Meninas that he's working on, or is he painting a portrait of the Infanta's parents, King Philip IV and Queen Mariana, whose reflections we can see in the mirror on the back wall? If so, are we the viewer meant to be standing in the shoes of the King and Queen? The search for the answers to these and many other questions has made Las Meninas possibly the single most debated and discussed picture in the history of art. But what is it about Velázquez's work that has intrigued so many? And why is it so often claimed that Velázquez is one of the greatest painters of all time? The story of Velázquez's life begins in 1599 in the southern inland Spanish port of Seville. At the time, the city was immensely wealthy. It was the chief port of trade with the New World. It was also a major religious centre, employing an army of painters to provide decorations and pictures for its churches and monasteries. One of the city's leading artists was Francisco Pacheco. This is Pacheco's Virgin of the Immaculate Conception, painted for Seville Cathedral. Pacheco was an intellectual and a vocal critic of the Spanish attitude that ranked painting merely as a craft. Pacheco took the Italian view that painting was a liberal art, the equal to poetry. It was into this environment that Velázquez arrived when, probably at the age of 11, he was apprenticed to Pacheco. He lived and worked with the artist for the next 6 years. But by the age of 19, his work shows how far he'd outstripped his master. Velázquez's depiction of the mystery of the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin, in which the future Mother of God appears as a young girl, floating in the heavens and standing on the moon, closely resembles the Pacheco in composition. But in the way Velázquez conjures up the solid presence of an innocent girl, there's no comparison. The Virgin's face, which many think Velázquez modelled on his own sister, Juana, is one we can believe existed in life. And what in the Pacheco looks conventional and formulaic, such as his painting of the clouds, in the Velázquez appears real, as in these ragged clouds bathed in moonlight. It's this commitment to observable reality rather than to idealizing invention that marks Velázquez's painting from the very start. The largest group of works to survive from Velázquez's early years in Seville are a series of intensely observed tavern and kitchen scenes. They are known as bodegones, a term that comes from the Spanish word bodegón, a wine cellar where in Velázquez's day cheap food and drink could be bought. Dawson Carr is curator of the Spanish and Italian paintings at the National Gallery, London, where one of Velázquez's great bodegones hangs today. It's called Kitchen Scene with Christ in the House of Martha and Mary.
Here we have a young artist who's declaring himself to be a realist, who's trying to find meaning, significance, beauty in everyday things. A woman, 2 women from his own time, juxtaposed with a scene from the Bible. And he's chosen this mannerist conceit, this anti-real conceit, to signify that he's already keenly interested in multiple levels of reality. And we're left to wonder, why do we have this juxtaposition, and what does it mean? What significance does that biblical scene have for these two women? Velázquez's realism is more than just describing objects, describing physical appearance. He seeks real people as well, ordinary people. And he finds in ordinary people doing ordinary things some great momentous significance.
Velázquez was fascinated by the idiosyncrasies of the human face, and his extraordinary ability to both see and capture these peculiarities in paint made him a brilliant portraitist. His depiction of Mother Jerónima de la Fuente shows a 66-year-old nun on the eve of her departure to found a convent in the Philippines. Here, with only the face and hands of the nun exposed, Velázquez nevertheless gives us a brilliant depiction of aged, weathered flesh. Not only that, he captures the woman's personality, her steely intelligence, her determination to overcome all obstacles, and her missionary zeal, wonderfully expressed in the way she grips the crucifix and the rules of her order. Velázquez's ambition to capture the character of his sitter, as well as their likeness, can also be seen in this early portrait of the poet and satirist Luis de Góngora. Velázquez seems to have given this image the breath of life, so that even today, after some 380 years, it's hard not to be transfixed by Góngora's withering gaze and the sardonic twist of his thin lips. Velázquez painted Góngora in 1622, during the first of two attempts to get employment in Madrid. As a city almost entirely devoted to the Spanish royal court, full of wealthy and influential patrons, Madrid was the prime destination for any Spanish artist of ambition. But gaining entry to the insular world living in the fortress palace of the Alcázar was difficult. In 1623, however, Velázquez was granted a brief audience to paint a portrait of the young king, the 18-year-old Philip IV. This picture is thought to be the result. Here Velázquez doesn't presume to portray the king's private character. Instead, he shows his sovereign looking out with an impassive gaze. This portrait is idealized, but in it Velázquez doesn't shy away from depicting the king's full lips and his prominent chin, both traits of the Habsburg dynasty. The image is also remarkably unadorned and direct, characteristics that mark it apart from earlier depictions of Philip, where the microscopic attention to finery and a rather poor grasp of anatomy had been more the norm. In the Velázquez, the king has real physical presence. There's even something quite sensuous about the highlight on his lip and the soft curl of his hair. Velázquez's outstanding talent and originality was immediately recognized by Philip IV. He was made a painter to the court, and soon rose to become chief painter to the king. From that point until his death over 30 years later, Velázquez remained a devoted royal servant. He rose through the ranks to become one of the king's most senior courtiers, and he earned the distinction of being the only Spanish artist Philip IV would sit to. When Velázquez came to work at the Alcázar, the palace not only housed the royal family, but also one of the greatest art collections in Europe. Given pride of place among these pictures were a remarkable group of masterpieces by Titian, the great 16th century Venetian painter. Titian's grand mythological subjects, such as his depiction of the goddess Diana and her nymphs being surprised by the hunter Actaeon, were revered for the sensuality with which he painted nudes. His portrayal of human passion, and the brilliance of his painting technique. Titian had enjoyed a very special relationship with two of Philip IV's ancestors, his grandfather Philip II, and his great-grandfather Charles V, who you see here in a Titian portrait. These men not only commissioned much of Titian's best work, but also honoured him with their personal friendship. It may have been that Philip IV soon began to view his relationship to Velázquez in the same way. But there was another artist who could lay claim to being the young king's Titian. This was Peter Paul Rubens, the great Flemish painter seen here, who in 1628 came to stay at the Spanish court for 9 months. At the time, Rubens was one of the most celebrated artists of Europe, and his work, such as this depiction of the Adoration of the Magi, was already represented in the Spanish royal collection. Velázquez could easily have seen Rubens as a rival, but instead it appears the two got on well, the older artist inspiring Velázquez to further his work through a study of Italian art. About the time Rubens was at court, Velázquez made his first attempt at a scene from ancient classical mythology. In The Feast of Bacchus, Velázquez depicts the god of wine as a fair-skinned youth crowned with vine leaves, whom he then surrounds with an extraordinary group of mostly rough, weather-beaten Spaniards. It's this group who have since given this picture its nickname, Los Borrachos, the drinkers. Like the figures in Velázquez's earlier bodegones, these men seem to be modelled on real people. Each one is an individual and is dressed in contemporary clothes, and the way they look out at us, drunken grins on their faces, makes them seem all the more immediate and real. Here Velázquez uses his powers of invention to show that this mythological god flourishes in the modern world, where his gift of wine helps ordinary mortals forget their cares. In 1629, not long after paying for Los Borrachos, Philip IV released Velázquez from his court duties and gave him a generous grant to travel to Italy. For the next 18 months Velázquez toured Italian cities, but spent most of his time in Rome. And while there he painted another mythological work, Apollo at the Forge of Vulcan. Inspired by the story told by the ancient Greek poet Ovid, Velázquez shows the moment when Apollo, the sun god, arrives at the Forge of Vulcan, the god of fire, to tell him that his wife, Venus, has been unfaithful. Although the treatment of the muscular figures shows how much Velázquez was responding to the idealized male nudes of classical sculpture and Renaissance painting in Rome, his vision of the mythological world is distinctly un-Italian. Velázquez places his classical figures in what appears to be a real forge, with beautifully observed tools, anvils, and pieces of burnished armour, all of which he must have observed from life. The faces and expressions of the figures also suggest he worked from real models. But perhaps what most separates this work from the art of Velázquez's contemporaries is his lack of reverence for his source material. Here a scene from Ovid takes on the flavour of Spanish comic theatre. The radiant Apollo, who was considered one of the most noble of the Olympian gods, is shown as a prim and rather effete young man. Vulcan, with his bulging eyes and posturing body language, seems the epitome of wounded machismo. Velázquez may have not entirely succumbed to the lure of Italian art, but Apollo at the Forge nevertheless shows how much he'd learnt by the encounter, particularly in the way he handled depth. In Los Borrachos, the drinkers were all squashed into the same narrow foreground space, overlapping and cutting each other off. In Apollo at the Forge, each player comfortably occupies his own patch of ground. With this leap in skill as an artist, Velázquez also seems to have started thinking about how to depict figures removed from the well-lit foreground action. The man in the back of Apollo at the Forge, for example, when looked at close up, is painted in an extraordinarily summary, out-of-focus way. Velázquez, it seems, was trying to find a way to reproduce in paint the experience of seeing things out of the corner of his eye. At around this time, Velázquez put his new command of space and his gifts for naturalism at the service of religion. In Christ After the Flagellation, contemplated by the Christian soul, Velázquez depicts the Saviour in a brightly lit, almost theatrical space. Bound to a pillar by a rope, he sits slumped and exhausted after being beaten. Blood trickles over his shoulders and spatters his legs. On the floor lie the stained ropes and flail left by his tormentors. Christ knows he is about to die, and in his distress he turns to see the child, who represents the faithful Christian soul kneeling in prayer. The aim of such a picture was for the faithful viewer to be moved to pray themselves. In showing the idealized perfection of Christ's body in real physical and mental distress, Velázquez created a work of great emotional intensity. When Velázquez was in Italy and heir to the Spanish throne, Baltasar Carlos was born. Philip IV refused to allow any other artist to paint him, and this portrait of the Crown Prince, showing him at the age of 2, and attended by one of the court dwarfs, was made by Velázquez a year after his return. In it, little Baltasar Carlos is shown in the military regalia that he wore at an official ceremony at which Spanish nobles swore him an oath of allegiance. It's a charming portrait where the prince appears both as a toddler and as the future king of Spain. The two realities summed up by Velázquez in the way he shows the prince's little fist tightly gripping the hilt of his sword. The 1630s were a time of great opulence at the Spanish court, and one of Velázquez's greatest portraits of the king shows him in a magnificent brown costume embroidered with silver, a suit so rich and splendid that it must have been created for a special occasion. Velázquez depicts Philip IV with customary detachment that reflects the king's rigid self-control in public. From a distance, Velázquez's portrait is striking for the stately demeanour of the king and the magnificence of his robes. But the closer you get to the picture surface, the more you become aware of the artist's extraordinary painting technique.
Most of the painters before Velázquez had expended great labor on illustrating the ornate embroidery of costumes. And Velázquez takes a very different point of view. Rather than elaborating and defining every detail, he develops this shorthand technique. And as one gets closer, it becomes obvious that they're brushstrokes on the surface of the canvas, seemingly almost randomly applied. He lays down a basic brown layer, and then on top of it, he puts in these broad strokes that define the shadows, and then the shapes of the embroidery, the pinwheels and the buttonholes. But he's done it with incredible understanding of the play of light on this beautiful embroidery, not elaborating every detail, but depending on the eye at a distance, blending what he has done and having it coalesce into this beautiful plush fabric.
From 1633, work began on the Buen Retiro, a vast new palace just outside Madrid, especially designed for lavish entertainments. With its own theatre, ballroom, picture galleries, pleasure grounds and menagerie, the Buen Retiro proved enormously expensive to build. In part to justify the cost to a public already overburdened with taxes, a great chamber called the Hall of Realms was included in the designs where state ceremonies could be held. Velázquez was put in charge of an exceptionally ambitious decorative scheme for this chamber, which included 27 works by 8 artists, 6 by Velázquez himself. The long walls, which were lined with battle scenes celebrating Spanish victories, included his magnificent Surrender of Breda, while at the far end of the hall, opposite the king's throne, were 3 royal portraits. Gabriele Finaldi is deputy director of the Prado Museum in Madrid, where the pictures hang today.
Well, the king stood at one end of the Hall of Realms, receiving distinguished visitors, And at the far end, at the opposite end, he could see a portrait of himself, of his wife, Isabella of Bourbon, and above the door, the picture which you see behind me here of the young Balthasar Carlos on horseback. You can see that he's a very regal young man already. This young boy was the great hope for the future of the monarchy, for the future of the Spanish Empire. He would eventually become king. That's what was thought at the time. He was a healthy young boy, which for Philip IV was terribly important. He'd had several other children before, all of whom had died in infancy, but it looked as if Balthasar Carlos was going to make it. He was a very handsome young boy. He was intelligent, he was sensitive, he was skillful, he was good at his lessons. He even learned how to draw and how to paint. So much was expected of him. The way Velázquez represents him, you see him adopting a regal position on horseback, commanding his horse in the way that kings should, illustrating all those qualities that a king needs of control, of poise, of ability, skillful dexterity on horseback, and so on.
Despite his reserved public persona, King Philip IV had his private passions. One of these was hunting, and in this portrait from the late 1630s, Velázquez shows the king in his hunting clothes, a hound by his side, and an arquebus in his hand, an unwieldy rifle with which the king was apparently a great shot. Much royal hunting took place in the countryside around Madrid, and while it was undoubtedly an entertainment for the king, like all things at the Spanish court, Philip's skill as a hunter had symbolic meaning too. In the largest landscape Velázquez is known to have painted, recently cleaned in the National Gallery's Conservation Department, the artist depicted a test of the king's horsemanship that was performed before the entire court.
Within court culture, hunting in general was seen as the living image of war. That is, the best preparation for war, and also for showing the monarch's prowess and ability to control nature. This particular type of hunting was like a tournament, something that was staged only occasionally, because it involved setting up this vast enclosure to capture the boar, and then this enclosure in which the main event took place. This form of hunting was not hunting at all, it was more baiting. They would use the wild boar because they were fierce and would charge repeatedly. In this case, we see the king on horseback engaging a boar coming his way. Now, these boar were big enough and strong enough that they could disembowel a horse, so it was essential that the boar's charge be diverted. The point was not the killing of the boar, but the display of fine horsemanship. And much as is the case with the equestrian portraits of the king, they're meant to show that he is in control of his animal, and in control of his animal while the animal is facing this charging beast. As was Velázquez's predilection, he doesn't focus on the main event, but rather presents this wonderful frieze of figures in the foreground. Members of the court going about activities surrounding this event, but many watching and some conversing, not at all involved with what's going on in the arena.
The Spanish royal family were attended by almost 1,700 courtiers and servants. Among them was a particular group that fascinated Velázquez, the court entertainers. They included actors and gestures and figures like the mentally challenged dwarf Francisco Lezcano, who Velázquez shows idly shuffling a pack of cards, a reference to Lezcano's supposedly confused state of mind. Unlike other courtiers, the entertainers were not bound by the strict rules of court etiquette. In painting them, Velázquez also seems to have taken liberties. He experiments with his technique, as in the haziness with which he paints Lezcano's face, with its equivocal expression. And he probes their characters in ways he never could in his royal portraits. This depiction of Sebastián de Mora, another of the dwarfs employed to amuse the royal family, is an intensely searching work. Its honesty as a portrait is almost painful. Velázquez doesn't hide de Mora's dwarfism. By showing him seated directly on the ground, he deliberately emphasizes his short stature. But in recording de Mora's fists balled in his lap, and the strength of his gaze that almost seems to have brought de Mora to the point of tears, Velázquez communicates the man's intelligence and his fierce, almost confrontational pride. It may seem appalling to us now that someone like de Mora was hired to be laughed at, or to highlight, by contrast, the supposed physical perfections of his masters. But Velázquez's portrayal is far from being voyeuristic or mocking. It not only records, through de Mora's costly robes, his high status at court, it also treats de Mora with tremendous dignity as an individual worthy of respect. Many of Velázquez's portraits of court entertainers were displayed in the royal residences used primarily for leisure. At the Torre de la Parada, the royal hunting lodge, they hung among a splendid display of pictures, which included a set of some 35 works by Rubens and a rare depiction of a male nude by Velázquez himself, his image of Mars, the god of war. As with his earlier Apollo at the Forge of Vulcan, Velázquez treats his mythological subject with a highly individual mixture of naturalism, humour, and in this case, pathos. Instead of depicting Mars as an idealized and virile hero, he shows him as an aging man whose muscles are beginning to sag and whose flesh is turning loose and soft. Mars sports a luxurious moustache, a sign of valour in Spain, but his gilded helmet looks at least a couple of sizes too big. He stares gloomily out from under its shadow, his chin resting on his fist, in a pose traditional to depictions of melancholy. The technique Velázquez uses in this picture, very finely ground pigments heavily diluted with oil, does a great deal to add to our sense of the god's presence as a real man. We see Mars as if through a filmy haze, a shimmering atmosphere. The outlines of his body are blurred. Looked at close to, some areas, such as his hand, make barely any sense at all. Again, Velázquez seems to be trying to find a technique to match visual experience, in this case, perhaps, the effect of his model breathing. The same technique was taken to even greater extremes in one of Velázquez's most famous mythological works, his Toilet of Venus, also known as the Rokeby Venus, after the British collection in which it was once housed. Probably painted at the end of the 1640s, Velázquez's use of diluted paint has reached such a level of virtuosity that he is able to suggest the soft body of the goddess and the sweep of her brown hair, with minimal amounts of pigment. The contours of Venus's body and face are so indistinct that, as with Mars, we gain the impression that we are in the presence of a living, breathing model. In composing this work, Velázquez drew on Italian prototypes, showing the goddess of love accompanied by her winged son Cupid. Among them was a painting by Titian in the Spanish royal collection, which showed the naked Venus reclining on a couch to the frank admiration of her viewer's gaze. But Velázquez's response to such works was highly original. Not only does he show Venus with her back to us, but also the only glimpse we get of her beautiful face is from her reflection caught in the mirror held by her son. Yet again Velázquez created an inverted composition, relegating what others would consider to be the most important part of the picture to the background. Not only that, he makes this essential part of the image very hard to read.
Venus's features aren't precisely rendered. Indeed, it's a very hazy image. And this leads us to wonder why. Why would he have shown this beautiful body and not a beautiful face? It may reflect the idea that perfect beauty, ideal beauty, was unrepresentable, impossible to represent. And this may be Velázquez's metaphor for that even I will not try to represent Venus's face. The other part of it that's very consistent with Velázquez is that he leaves it open. He leaves it open for the viewer to complete that face. And this, of course, brings it home and makes it very much more real for everyone who stands in front of the picture.
Ever since Velázquez had entered royal service in the late 1620s, he'd been continually promoted. By the 1640s he was a senior courtier and was entrusted with overseeing the design and decoration of the major renovation of the Alcázar. Such responsibility meant he painted less, but in 1648 his role as designer led to another trip to Italy when Philip IV sent him on a mission to acquire pictures and sculptures for the palace. Settling in Rome once more, Velázquez began painting with new enthusiasm, and it was there that he completed what many consider to be the finest portrait of his career, his depiction of Pope Innocent X. Seemingly limiting his palette to just 3 colours, red, white and gold, Velázquez gives an astonishing bravura display of his skills as a painter. Bathing his subject in light, he captures the sheen of the Pope's silken cape with long flowing strokes of the brush. The golden finials of the chair are rendered by near abstract dots and dabs of colour that magically assemble in the eye to suggest polished metal. While with tremendous audacity, Velázquez leaves other marks plainly exposed, such as the rough dark strokes that edge the Pope's hand and the sheet of paper on which a rare signature by the artist appears. These techniques astonished the Italians, who were used to smooth, carefully finished pictures, but what completely stunned them was Velázquez's capacity to capture the character and presence of a sitter by such informal means. Pope Innocent X draws our gaze like a magnet and returns it with all the wary mistrust for which he was well known. This is a man who held on to power with an iron grip, and somehow Velázquez makes this clear even when depicting the pontiff's relaxed hand. The picture was widely admired and probably led directly to Velázquez being asked to join 2 of Rome's prestigious painting societies. It was at the annual exhibition of one of these that Velázquez displayed another brilliant portrait showing Juan de Pareja, one of his painting assistants who had travelled with him from Spain. When examined closely, this work shows how sparingly Velázquez was using paint by this date. There's barely any drawn detail, rather it all seems subtle inflections and shifts in colour. It's only when looked at from a distance that these marks translate into the solid forms of eyelashes, a nose, a beard and lips, and then the whole of Pareja's dignified head sitting atop a lace-trimmed collar and grey-green doublet. The reaction to this picture must have been everything Velázquez hoped for. Antonio Palomino, an early biographer, reported that it gained such universal applause that in the opinion of all, everything else seemed like painting, but this alone like truth. Velázquez was reluctant to leave Rome, but his presence was very much required back in Madrid. A series of misfortunes in previous years had led to a dynastic crisis. In 1644, Philip IV's queen, Isabella, had died, followed 2 years later by the sudden death of the heir, Prince Baltasar Carlos. Philip IV had been reluctant to remarry, but while Velázquez had been away in Rome, he had finally taken a bride, his 14-year-old niece, Mariana of Austria. This picture of the new queen, painted by Velázquez on his return from Italy, marks the beginning of a group of royal portraits, all painted by the artist in his 50s. It's clear that Velázquez has had to readjust to the stiff, impersonal formality demanded by the Spanish court. The young queen stands in a rigid pose, in part enforced by her tight corset and the crinoline holding out the enormous skirts of her dress. She stares out impassively, perhaps you might even say sadly, from beneath her heavy makeup and elaborate wig. This was not the place for psychological insight, and one gets the sense Velázquez perhaps got more artistic interest from painting the clock in the background, a passage that must rank among the most brilliant pieces of still life painting of his career. The arrival of new royal children, however, allowed Velázquez to explore a less formal style of royal portrait. The firstborn was Infanta Margarita, seen here at the age of 2. As Margarita was betrothed at birth to her cousin, Leopold of Germany, the future Holy Roman Emperor, Velázquez regularly painted her portrait for dispatch to Vienna, where Leopold could view her progress. For many years Margarita was the only one of Philip IV's new family to have survived, and it may be because of her status as a precious child that she appears in the centre of Las Meninas. But in 1657, new hope for the Spanish throne arrived with the birth of a son, Felipe Prospero. This portrait shows the 2-year-old crown prince dressed in skirts, as was the custom for infant boys, but adopting a suitably regal pose with his tiny hand resting on the back of a small chair. Velázquez respectfully shows how the crown prince has inherited his father's pale complexion, but he also takes the liberty of playfully echoing Felipe's white blonde hair, bulging forehead, and large dark eyes in the appealing look of the lapdog that rests its chin on the arm of the chair. For all this portrait's charm, Velázquez couldn't help but record Felipe's obvious frailty. A victim of the Habsburg tradition of marrying within close family, he was a sickly child from birth. In comparison to Velázquez's earlier portraits of the infant Baltasar Carlos, the contrast is stark. Here there's no military uniform or sword. Instead, Felipe is shown in his nursery clothes, bedecked with amulets and charms intended to ward off the evil eye and sorcery. Sadly, the prince did not survive to his 5th birthday. With personal losses, dynastic worries and a steady decline in Spanish power, Philip IV retreated further into the protected world of the court. There, with Velázquez's loyal support, he continued to refurbish his palaces, although he was now reluctant to sit for his portrait. "I do not want to see myself growing old," he wrote. In this last portrait Velázquez painted of the king, Philip IV is shown in the same pose and almost the same style of clothes as those he had worn in the first portrait of some 30 years before. Here Velázquez shows the familiar radiant paleness and the soft blonde hair. But now he also notes the king's nascent double chin and a greater droop to his heavily lidded eyes. Velázquez's technique has also changed to become exceptionally spare and subtle. It's a mere suggestion of paint, for example, that creates the shadowed fall of the king's hair. It's the barest shift in pigment that conjures up the effect of the king's blonde eyelashes catching the light. It's just tiny dots and drags of paint that make up the gold chain from which hangs the badge of the Order of the Golden Fleece. Throughout his life, Velázquez had worked to perfect the art of using oil paint on canvas to capture as honestly as he could the experience of seeing the world. On the way, he'd rejected time-honoured artistic formulas. He doggedly pursued his own observations and had honed his skills in grasping both the character of individuals and their relationship to fortune and power. But as Velázquez's work developed, a paradox emerged. The more he pursued a technique that, at a distance, would mimic the way we grasp the world through sight, the more his pictures, when seen close to, began to draw attention to themselves as surfaces covered in individual, sometimes seemingly abstract, paint strokes. The more his work approached what contemporaries called the truth, the more his work also became obvious as art. This play between art and life, between illusion and reality, forms the theme of 2 great works that Velázquez produced in the last 5 years of his life. In the fable of Arachne, which is also known as Las Hilanderas, or the Spinners, Velázquez plays on different levels of reality by mixing what looks like a view of a modern spinning workshop with a scene from ancient mythology. In the well-lit background, the helmeted figure of Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, appears to have freed herself from a tapestry to cast her curse upon Arachne, the fabled weaver who had dared to set herself up in competition to the gods. This is a complex scene, but one which Velázquez puts in second place to the shadowed activity of the foreground, in which he includes his most audacious depiction of an optical phenomenon. Here Velázquez shows us a spinning wheel in motion, without painting a single one of its spokes. Through intense and honest observation, Velázquez understood what only modern science and technology has been able to verify, that there is a limit to how quickly humans can process visual information, so that when objects are seen in swift motion, they will appear blurred. In Las Meninas, Velázquez's great painting about the act of painting, he drew together the discoveries of a lifetime's artistic inquiry. Here there's depth, the hazy peripheral figures, the searching portraits, and the idealized portrayal of majesty. And here too is perhaps the ultimate inverted composition, where the most important figures in the scene, the King and Queen of Spain, are not even present, but are instead glimpsed in a mirror that possibly reflects their position outside the picture, in the viewer's space.
Velázquez painted this on its most primary level for an audience of one, for the king himself, so that when the king stood before it, the image was truly complete. And of course, this emphasizes that his art was in the service of the king. And so any other viewer who stands in front of it has to question, well, this can't be real. It's not, the king and queen aren't here. It's not reflecting them in it. Of course, it stresses that this is a work of art at a distance when it's playing in 3 dimensions and it seems that the scene is extended before you. Boom. Here's this mirror that calls your attention. No, this can't possibly be real. And then as one approaches the picture, of course, it dissolves into brushwork. He involves the viewer in the ultimate conundrum of visual representation, that this is only paint on a canvas, but look at what I can do with the least amount of paint I can possibly place on this object.
On a personal level, Las Meninas also records Velázquez's fulfillment of a life's ambition, to gain recognition for the nobility of his art as a painter. Here he not only depicts himself painting in the company of royalty, the very highest compliment to his craft, but he was able, some 3 years after completing the work, to add to his chest the red cross that marks him as a member of the Noble Order of Santiago. When Velázquez died in 1660, aged 61, he was buried with full honours befitting his position as a senior courtier, a Knight of the Order of Santiago, and the chief painter to the King of Spain.
Esto ha sido todo, espero que haya sido de vuestro interés. No olvidéis darle a me gusta y compartir el vídeo, suscribiros al canal si aún no lo habéis hecho y activar la campanita para que os lleguen todas las notificaciones. También podéis contribuir al sostenimiento del canal mediante donaciones vía BIZUM al número que podéis ver en pantalla. Podéis encontrarnos en distintas redes sociales como dejamos indicadas. Un saludo y hasta pronto.